The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished oak floors of the Reynolds family dining room as Martha Reynolds arranged the china with meticulous precision. Each porcelain plate, wedding gifts from 27 years prior, bore the delicate blue pattern that had become synonymous with Sunday suppers at the Reynolds household. All except one. "Caroline, be careful with that silver," Martha called to her daughter without looking up. At 19, Caroline possessed a grace that belied her youth. But Martha couldn't help but worry. The sterling had been in the family for generations. "Yes, mother," Caroline replied, her voice carrying the slight musical lilt that reminded Martha so painfully of her own mother. From the kitchen came the sounds of Bessie, their cook since before Caroline was born, directing her young assistant in the final preparations for the meal. The Reynolds home on Woodland Street stood as testament to Thomas Reynolds' success in the mercantile business. Not the grandest home in Nashville, but respectable. 3 stories of red brick with white columns and a view of the Cumberland River that Thomas often declared was worth every penny of the mortgage. They had moved there in 1903, when Nashville's prosperity seemed limitless, and Thomas's business connections with the railroad had finally paid dividends. Thomas entered from his study, pocket watch in hand. "Nearly 5. Robert should be arriving shortly." His voice carried the weight of anticipation. Their eldest son was returning from his first year at Vanderbilt Medical School, and Thomas could scarcely contain his pride. "And William?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. Thomas's expression darkened momentarily. "I've sent word to his boarding house. Whether he chooses to honor us with his presence remains to be seen." The tension that accompanied any mention of their younger son hung in the air. At 22, William had rejected his father's offers to join the family business, instead taking a position at the Nashville Tennessean as a junior reporter. His articles, particularly those sympathetic to labor unions and women's suffrage, had become a source of considerable strain between father and son. "He'll come," Martha said with quiet certainty. "He always does." The doorbell's chime interrupted any response Thomas might have made. Moments later, Ida, their housekeeper, ushered in Robert Reynolds, his Vanderbilt medical coat exchanged for a well-tailored suit, his smile wide as he embraced his mother. "Mother, you look wonderful," he said, kissing her cheek. "You're late," Thomas said, though his stern tone was betrayed by the warmth in his eyes as he shook his son's hand. "Forgive me, Father. Dr. Littlefield kept us longer than expected. We were discussing the implications of the new antiseptic techniques being used in the field hospitals in Europe." Robert's eyes shone with enthusiasm. "The medical advancements from this war may revolutionize." "Not at the dinner table, Robert," Martha interjected gently. "Your sister doesn't need to hear about such things." Caroline, who had been arranging flowers at the sideboard, turned with a flash of indignation. "I read the newspapers, Mother. The women in England are training as nurses by the thousands. I hardly think discussions of antiseptics will shock my delicate constitution." Martha exchanged a glance with Thomas. Caroline's increasingly modern ideas were another source of quiet concern. Her friendship with Sarah Dudley, whose mother was involved with the Nashville Equal Suffrage League, had introduced notions that Martha found both admirable and alarming. The door chime sounded again, and moments later, William Reynolds entered the dining room. His collar was slightly askew, his hair longer than fashion dictated, but his eyes, the same deep brown as his father's, were clear and direct. "I hope I'm not late," he said, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on his father. Thomas checked his pocket watch pointedly. 5 minutes past the hour. We were about to sit without you." "William!" Caroline moved quickly to embrace her brother. "I've saved all your articles. The piece about the conditions at the cotton mill was exceptionally well done." "Yes," Thomas said dryly. "Mr. Patterson at First National Bank mentioned it specifically when I met with him regarding our loan extension." William's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Martha intervened. "Shall we sit? Bessie has prepared roast duck, and it won't improve with waiting." As they took their places around the table, Thomas at the head, Martha at the foot, the children arranged between. Ida entered carrying a tureen of soup. Behind her, Bessie appeared with a large covered platter that she placed before Thomas for carving. It was then that Martha noticed it. Among the familiar blue-patterned plates lay one that didn't belong. In place of Caroline's usual setting was a plate Martha had never seen before, ornate gold leaf around the edges, with an intricate pattern of crimson flowers at its center. "Caroline," Martha began, "where did this plate come from?" Caroline looked up, confusion crossing her features. "Which plate, Mother?" "The one at your place." Caroline glanced down, her brow furrowing. "This isn't—" She stopped, her expression changing. "Oh, I found it in the china cabinet this morning. I thought it was part of the set Great-Aunt Susanna sent last Christmas." "It most certainly is not," Martha said. "Thomas, have you seen this before?" Thomas, who had been about to begin carving the duck, paused to examine the plate. His expression changed subtly, so subtly that only Martha, who had spent nearly 3 decades reading her husband's moods, would have noticed. "Where exactly did you find this, Caroline?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "In the cabinet with the other good china. It was wrapped in linen at the back." Caroline's eyes moved from her father to her mother. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," Thomas said quickly, too quickly. "It's just unusual, that's all." The meal proceeded with forced normalcy. Robert spoke of his studies, carefully avoiding mentions of war wounds after his mother's earlier admonishment. William described a new streetcar line being planned for the east side of the city. Caroline remained quieter than usual, occasionally glancing down at the mysterious plate that now held her portion of duck and spring vegetables. It was during the dessert course, Bessie's peach cobbler, a Reynolds family favorite, that William finally addressed what had become increasingly obvious throughout the meal. "Father, you know something about that plate, don't you?" His reporter's instinct for unspoken truths had not been dulled by the heavy meal. Thomas set down his spoon. For a moment, he seemed to be calculating something, weighing options only he could see. "It belonged to a woman named Eleanor Caldwell," he said finally. "She was the daughter of Judge Harold Caldwell." Martha's spoon clattered against her plate. "Thomas, surely this isn't—" "They should know, Martha," Thomas said quietly. "They're not children anymore." "Know what?" Robert leaned forward, medical curiosity evident in his posture. Thomas folded his hands before him, an uncharacteristic gesture of uncertainty from a man usually so decisive. "Eleanor Caldwell was engaged to be married to Richard Reynolds in 1878. Richard was my older brother." The silence that followed was profound. None of the Reynolds children spoke. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed to have been swallowed by the weight of Thomas's words. "You never told us you had a brother," Caroline finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He died before any of you were born," Thomas replied. There seemed little reason to speak of such painful matters. "How did he die?" William asked, his journalist's directness cutting through the room's tension. Thomas and Martha exchanged a glance laden with decades of shared secrets. "That," Thomas said carefully, "is a complicated story, and it begins and ends with the plate your sister is using tonight." The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7 as Thomas Reynolds rose from the dining table and gestured toward his study. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable." Martha began to protest, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned to Ida. "Please bring coffee to the study and ask Bessie if she would mind staying a bit later this evening." The Reynolds children followed their father through the house with the quiet tension of those about to be initiated into long-held family secrets. Thomas's study, with its leather-bound books and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco, had always been a sanctum of masculine authority in the household. Caroline could count on one hand the number of times she had been invited inside. As they settled into the chairs arranged before the unlit fireplace, Thomas opened a cabinet and withdrew a crystal decanter. "I think the occasion calls for something stronger than coffee," he said, pouring a small measure of amber liquid into 5 glasses. He handed them around, not excluding Caroline despite Martha's raised eyebrow. "To absent family," he said, raising his glass in a toast that seemed to hold more meaning than the simple words conveyed. After they had all sipped, Caroline managing not to grimace at the burning sensation of her first taste of whiskey, Thomas set his glass down and began his tale. "My brother Richard was 7 years my senior, and as the firstborn son, he was groomed from childhood to take over our father's shipping business. Richard was everything I was not: charming, handsome, quick to laugh. By 25, he had already expanded our father's modest shipping concern to include interests in railroads and coal." Thomas paused, his gaze distant, seeing a past his children had never known. In the spring of 1878, Richard became engaged to Eleanor Caldwell, daughter of Judge Harold Caldwell, one of Nashville's most prominent citizens. The match was considered perfect. Both families were well established, both young people were well educated and well regarded. The wedding was set for September of that year. Martha interjected softly, "The china service with that plate was a wedding gift from Judge Caldwell to his daughter. It was custom-made in France." "What happened?" Robert asked, leaning forward in his chair. Thomas took another sip of his whiskey before continuing. "In July of 1878, a steamboat called the Southern Belle exploded on the Cumberland River. 37 people died. Richard had arranged the shipping contract and personally inspected the vessel before its departure. The investigation revealed that the boiler had been improperly maintained," William guessed, his reporter's mind assembling the facts. Thomas nodded grimly. Richard had cut corners on maintenance to increase profits. He had been warned about the boiler's condition, but chose to ignore those warnings. Caroline gasped softly. "And people died because of it?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed, including Judge Caldwell's younger son James, who was only 17. He had been sent to oversee the shipment of some family heirlooms to their summer home in Louisville. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of tragedy reaching across decades. "The Caldwell family was destroyed by grief," Martha said quietly. "Eleanor broke the engagement, of course. Judge Caldwell used his influence to ensure that Richard faced charges of criminal negligence." "Was he convicted?" William asked, his expression suggesting he was already calculating the implications for his own journalistic crusades against corporate malfeasance. "No," Thomas replied, his voice hardening. "Our father used every connection, every favor, every dollar he had to protect Richard. The case was eventually dismissed due to insufficient evidence. But in Nashville society, the verdict of public opinion was clear. The Reynolds name became synonymous with corruption and callousness." Robert, ever the pragmatist, furrowed his brow. "But clearly the family recovered its standing. Father's business is respected. We live in this home. We recovered our standing because Richard died before he could bring further shame upon the family name," Thomas interrupted, his voice sharp with an emotion his children rarely witnessed. "And because I spent decades rebuilding what he destroyed in a moment of greed." "How did Richard die?" Caroline asked softly, her fingers unconsciously tracing the rim of her whiskey glass. Thomas and Martha exchanged another of their inscrutable looks. "Officially," Thomas said carefully, "he took his own life in December of 1878, 3 months after the charges were dismissed. He was found in his room with an empty bottle of laudanum." "And unofficially?" William pressed. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening Nashville sky. "There were rumors. Nashville was smaller then, and people talked. Some said Eleanor Caldwell had cursed him. Others suggested Judge Caldwell had arranged a more direct revenge, but nothing was ever proven." "And the plate?" Caroline asked. "How did it come to be in our china cabinet?" Martha answered this time, her voice soft but steady. "After Eleanor broke the engagement, she returned all of Richard's gifts. But she kept the china service. It was, after all, a gift from her father, not from Richard. After her brother's death, Eleanor was never the same. She became reclusive, refused most social invitations. She never married. She died last spring, Thomas continued, turning back from the window. A distant cousin of the Caldwells visited us last month. Apparently, Eleanor left instructions that after her death, one plate from her china service should be delivered to the Reynolds family. No, but why just one plate? Robert asked. The note that accompanied it said simply, "So that they may remember," Martha replied. Caroline looked down at her hands, trying to process the weight of this family history she had never known. "And you've kept this secret all these years? The scandal, Uncle Richard, all of it?" "We wanted to protect you," Martha said. "And by the time you were old enough to understand, it seemed unnecessary to burden you with past tragedies." We built a new legacy," Thomas added firmly. "My business practices have always been beyond reproach. I've worked to ensure the Reynolds name stands for integrity now." William, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Is that why you react so strongly to my articles? You see them as a threat to the reputation you've rebuilt?" Thomas considered his younger son with new awareness. "Perhaps," he admitted. "Though I also believe some of your positions are naive and potentially harmful to the very people you wish to help." This concession, small as it was, seemed to shift something between father and son. Ida appeared at the door with the coffee service, momentarily interrupting the tension. As she poured, the family fell silent, each lost in private thoughts. After Ida departed, Caroline asked the question that had been forming in her mind since her father began his story. What happened to the rest of the china service? According to the cousin, Eleanor requested that it be sold and the proceeds donated to a fund for the families of riverboat accident victims, Martha answered. "All except the one plate," Robert noted. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "Our plate, our reminder." "But why did it appear tonight?" Caroline pressed. "Who put it on the table?" Thomas and Martha looked at each other again, and this time their shared glance held something like fear. "I assumed your mother had decided it was time to tell you the story," Thomas said slowly. "And I thought you had placed it there, Thomas," Martha replied, her voice barely audible. A chill seemed to settle over the study despite the warmth of the spring evening outside. "Bessie or Ida must have found it and thought it belonged with the good china," Robert suggested reasonably. "Perhaps," Thomas agreed, though his tone suggested he found this explanation insufficient. William stood suddenly. "I think we should ask them." Minutes later, both Bessie and Ida stood uncomfortably in the study doorway, both denying any knowledge of the plate's appearance. "I ain't never seen that plate before tonight, Mr. Reynolds," Bessie insisted, her hands twisted in her apron. "And I've been polishing your china for 15 years. I set the table with exactly what Mrs. Reynolds laid out," Ida added firmly. After they had been dismissed, the family sat in uneasy silence. "It's just a plate," Robert finally said, his medical training inclining him toward rational explanations. "Someone must have placed it there and simply forgotten doing so." "Of course," Martha agreed too quickly. "These old houses, sometimes things appear in unexpected places." But Caroline was watching her father, who had grown increasingly pale as the evening progressed. "Father, what aren't you telling us?" Thomas Reynolds, pillar of Nashville society and paragon of business acumen, suddenly looked older than his 53 years. "Eleanor Caldwell died on this date last year," he said quietly. "May 15th, 1914. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks, though no fire had been lit. "And there's something else," Thomas continued reluctantly. "Something I haven't told even your mother." Martha looked up sharply. "Thomas!" Thomas took a deep breath. "Before Richard died, or perhaps I should say, was found dead, he confessed something to me. He admitted that he had known the boiler was dangerously defective, but he also claimed he hadn't been alone in making the decision to send the boat out regardless." "What do you mean?" William asked, leaning forward. "He said he had a business partner who insisted they couldn't afford the delay that repairs would cause. Someone whose investment in the shipping line was at risk if the schedule wasn't maintained." Thomas's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "He named Judge Caldwell. as his silent partner. Eleanor's father? Caroline gasped. But that would mean that Judge Caldwell was partially responsible for his own son's death, Robert finished, his medical detachment allowing him to state what the others could barely contemplate. If that's true, William said slowly, then the judge's campaign to destroy Richard was a cover-up, Thomas confirmed grimly. A way to ensure all blame fell on my brother while the judge maintained his reputation and position. Did you ever confront him with this? Martha asked, shock evident in her usually composed features. No, Thomas admitted. I had only Richard's word, the word of a disgraced man facing ruin. And after his death it seemed pointless. The damage was done. But now Eleanor has sent this plate, Caroline said thoughtfully, as if she wanted the truth to come out after all these years. If she even knew the truth, Robert countered. She may have simply been making a final gesture of bitterness toward our family. William stood and began to pace, his journalist's mind working through the implications. Father, you rebuilt the Reynolds name by being everything Richard wasn't. Cautious, ethical, above reproach. What if that wasn't just about family pride? What if it was atonement? Thomas didn't answer directly, but the look on his face suggested William had struck close to some essential truth. The plate appeared tonight for a reason, Caroline said with sudden conviction. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, I think she knew more than we realize. As if in response to her words, a gust of wind rattled the study windows, though the evening was still. The electric lights, still a relatively new feature in the Reynolds home, flickered momentarily. This is absurd, Robert declared, ever the man of science. We're allowing ourselves to be carried away by coincidence and suggestion. Perhaps, Thomas said, rising from his chair with evident weariness. But there's one more thing you should know. The night Richard died, he told me he had been seeing visions of James Caldwell. The boy would appear to him, soaking wet from the river, saying nothing, just watching. Richard was convinced James had come to take him to judgment. Despite the warmth of the study, Caroline felt a chill run through her. And you, Father, have you ever seen such visions? Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment before answering. No, he said finally, but sometimes, in my dreams, I hear the sound of a steamboat whistle, and I wake knowing there's a debt still unpaid. Dawn broke over Nashville with the promise of a perfect spring day, the kind that made the city's residents forget the sweltering humidity that would arrive with summer. But in the Reynolds household, the morning light seemed unable to dispel the shadows cast by the previous night's revelations. Caroline descended the stairs early, having slept poorly. The house was quiet, save for the sounds of Bessie preparing breakfast in the kitchen. On impulse, Caroline turned toward the dining room, rather than following the scent of coffee and biscuits. The table had been cleared and reset for breakfast, the mysterious plate nowhere to be seen. Caroline opened the china cabinet, scanning the familiar blue-patterned dishes for the intruder with its crimson flowers and gold leaf. It wasn't there. "Looking for something, Miss Caroline?" Bessie's voice startled her. Caroline turned to find the cook watching her from the doorway, a dish towel in her hands. "The plate from last night, the odd one. Do you know where it is?" Bessie's expression remained carefully neutral. "Can't say that I do. Ida cleared up after you all went to your father's study. Could you ask her about it when she comes in?" "Course I will," Bessie agreed, though something in her tone suggested she doubted the inquiry would yield results. Caroline hesitated, then asked, "Bessie, you've been with our family since before I was born. Did you ever hear talk about my Uncle Richard? Or about the steamboat accident?" Bessie's hand stilled on the dish towel. "Ain't my place to speak on family matters, Miss Caroline? Please, Bessie, I need to understand." The older woman sighed, glancing toward the kitchen as if to ensure they were truly alone. "Your mama asked me never to mention it, but since she's told you herself now..." She looked down at her hands. "My cousin Isaiah was on that boat. He worked as a deckhand, left behind a wife and 3 little ones." Caroline felt the blood drain from her face. "Bessie, I had no idea." "Weren't no reason you should," Bessie replied simply. Happened long before you were born. Is that why you came to work for our family? Because of what happened? Bessie's laugh held no humor. Lord, no, child. I came because I needed work, and your mama needed help with you babies. Wasn't till later I learned the connection. She paused. Your mama, she found out somehow, paid for my cousin's youngest to go to school at Fisk. Never said a word about it to me, but I knew. This new piece of information, this evidence of her mother's quiet atonement, settled over Caroline like a mantle. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. Bessie nodded, then turned back toward the kitchen. Breakfast in 20 minutes. Better get yourself ready. Caroline found her mother in the small sitting room adjoining the master bedroom. Martha was already dressed for the day, her hair perfectly arranged, but the shadows beneath her eyes betrayed her restless night. "Did you know about Bessie's cousin?" Caroline asked without preamble. Martha looked up from the letter she was writing. For a moment it seemed she might deny knowledge, but then her shoulders sagged slightly. "Yes, I discovered it by chance, years after she came to us." "By then you children had grown attached to her and she was—" Martha hesitated. "She was family in her way. So you paid for her cousin's child to attend Fisk?" Martha's eyebrows rose in surprise. "She told you that?" "Yes, just now." "I see." Martha set down her pen. "It seemed the least we could do. One small attempt to balance the scales." Caroline took a seat across from her mother. "The plate is missing. It's not in the china cabinet, and Bessie hasn't seen it. Perhaps your father has put it somewhere safe." "Perhaps," Caroline agreed, though she wasn't convinced. "Mother, there's something I don't understand. If Father believed Judge Caldwell was partially responsible for the accident, why didn't he ever use that information, even just to clear Uncle Richard's name within the family?" Martha was quiet for a long moment. "Your father is a complicated man, Caroline. He loved his brother, but he also recognized Richard's failings. And after the tragedy, well, Thomas was determined to be different, better. That's not really an answer." "No," Martha admitted. "It isn't." She looked at her daughter with new awareness. "You're not a child anymore, are you?" "None of you are," she sighed. "The truth is, I don't know why Thomas kept that secret. Perhaps he felt the burden of it would corrupt your grandfather, as it had corrupted Richard. Perhaps he feared no one would believe him without proof. Or perhaps—" She trailed off. "Perhaps what, Mother?" "Perhaps he made a bargain of some kind," Martha said softly, "with Judge Caldwell, with himself, with God. I don't know. There are parts of your father that remain mysterious to me, even after all these years." Before Caroline could press further, there was a knock at the door, and William appeared. Unlike his usual disheveled appearance, he was immaculately dressed, his reporter's notebook in hand. "I'm going to the newspaper archives," he announced. "I want to read the original coverage of the Southern Belle disaster." "Is that wise?" Martha asked, concern evident in her voice. "After all this time?" "I'm not planning to write an exposé, Mother," William assured her. "I just want to understand. For my own sake." Martha studied her younger son, seeing perhaps for the first time not the rebellious boy, but the thoughtful man he was becoming. "Very well, but please be discreet." "I'll come with you," Caroline declared, standing. When both William and Martha looked surprised, she added, "2 sets of eyes will be more efficient than one." William grinned. "My scholarly sister, always practical." "Be back for supper," Martha instructed. "Your father and I need to discuss, well, many things." As Caroline and William prepared to leave, Robert appeared in the hallway, medical bag in hand. "Off to the hospital already?" William asked. "Dr. Littlefield has invited me to observe a new procedure," Robert explained, his excitement evident despite the solemnity that had settled over the household. "I shouldn't be late, but don't wait if I am." Martha kissed her eldest son's cheek. "Be careful, dear." After Robert had departed, Caroline and William made their way to the Nashville Tennessean's archives. As a reporter, William had privileged access, and soon they were seated at a table piled with bound volumes of newspapers from 1878. The coverage of the Southern Belle disaster was extensive. Front-page headlines declared it "Tragedy on the Cumberland" and 37 souls lost in steamboat explosion. The initial reports focused on rescue efforts and the identification of victims, but within days, the narrative shifted to questions of responsibility. "Look at this," William said, pointing to an article dated July 28, 1878. "Judge Caldwell is quoted demanding a full investigation. He specifically names Richard Reynolds as the owner who sacrificed safety for profit." "But if father is right, the judge was a partner in the enterprise," Caroline mused. "He would have known about the boiler issues too." "Exactly. He redirected blame entirely onto Richard." They continued reading, tracing the progression of the scandal through the summer and early fall of 1878. The coverage was damning for Richard Reynolds, with multiple witnesses citing his dismissal of safety concerns. Judge Caldwell appeared repeatedly, a grieving father, channeling his pain into a crusade for justice. "Here's something interesting," Caroline said, carefully turning the brittle pages of a September issue. "This mentions that Judge Caldwell had recently invested heavily in a competing shipping line, one that stood to benefit significantly from the Reynolds Company's disgrace." William leaned over to read the passage. "Good catch. So he had financial motivation beyond just covering his own involvement." They continued their research through the lunch hour, piecing together the story from fragmentary sources. By mid-afternoon, a clearer picture had emerged. So Judge Caldwell used his son's death to destroy Richard while simultaneously protecting himself and positioning his new investment to take over the Reynolds shipping routes, William summarized, making notes. And it worked. By October, the Reynolds shipping line was effectively defunct. And in December, Richard was dead, Caroline added quietly. William tapped his pencil against his notebook. "The coverage of his death is minimal. Just a small notice stating that Richard Reynolds, recently embroiled in controversy, had passed away at home. No mention of suicide or laudanum. Father said grandfather used his influence to keep the details quiet. But there's nothing here about Richard claiming the judge was his partner either. If he made such an accusation publicly, it would have been reported." Caroline frowned. "So he only told father, in private, and father kept the secret, even after Richard died. Why?" William wondered aloud. "What did he gain by protecting Judge Caldwell?" Caroline was about to respond when she noticed a small item in a December 15, 1878 paper. "William, look at this." The brief article reported that Thomas Reynolds, brother of the late Richard Reynolds, had been appointed to the board of First National Bank of Nashville. The appointment was noted as unusual given Thomas's youth and the recent scandal surrounding his family. The president of the bank was Judge Caldwell's brother-in-law, William said slowly, the implications becoming clear. This position would have been crucial for Thomas to rebuild the family business. "So that was the bargain," Caroline whispered. "Father's silence in exchange for a chance to restore the Reynolds name." William sat back, running a hand through his hair. "He sacrificed justice for his brother to secure our future. Can we blame him?" Caroline asked. "He was young, the family was ruined, and Richard was already gone." "No," William admitted. "I don't think I can blame him. But it explains so much about father, his insistence on propriety, his obsession with the family's reputation, his discomfort with my more provocative articles. He built his life on a compromise," Caroline said. "And now Eleanor Caldwell's plate has appeared to remind him of it." They gathered their notes and returned the bound newspapers to the archive clerk. As they stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, Caroline was struck by how ordinary Nashville appeared. Streetcars rumbling past, people going about their business, utterly unaware of the decades-old tragedy that had shaped her family. "What do we do with this information?" she asked her brother as they walked toward home. William was quiet for several blocks before answering. "I don't know. Part of me wants to write the true story, to finally set the record straight. But another part understands why father kept the secret," Caroline finished for him. "Yes, and wonders if disturbing the past would do more harm than good. They arrived home to find the house unusually quiet. Robert had not yet returned from the hospital, and neither of their parents was immediately visible. "Mrs. Reynolds is resting," Ida informed them when questioned. "Mr. Reynolds has gone to his office downtown. He asked that you wait for his return." Caroline and William exchanged glances. It was unlike their father to leave the house on a Sunday, particularly after such a momentous family discussion. "I think I'll check on Mother," Caroline said, heading upstairs. She found Martha not resting but sitting fully dressed by her bedroom window, gazing out at the garden. "Mother, are you all right?" Martha turned, and Caroline was startled by the redness around her eyes. Her mother rarely cried. "Did you find what you were looking for in the archives?" Martha asked instead of answering. "Yes, I think so." Caroline hesitated, then decided directness was best. "Father made a deal with Judge Caldwell, didn't he? His silence in exchange for a position at the bank." Martha didn't seem surprised by Caroline's conclusion. "Yes, though it wasn't quite that simple. Thomas believes still, that he made the best choice available to him at the time. I'm not judging him, Mother." "Aren't you?" Martha's gaze was penetrating. "We all judge, Caroline. It's human nature, even when we try not to." Caroline took a seat opposite her mother. "Where has Father gone?" "To Eleanor Caldwell's house." This was unexpected. "But she's dead." "Yes, but the house still stands. It's been vacant since her death, awaiting the settlement of her estate. Thomas received a telephone call this morning from Eleanor's cousin, the same one who delivered the plate. Apparently, there are papers Eleanor left specifically for Thomas to be delivered in the event that—" Martha paused. "In the event of what, Mother?" "In the event that the plate was accepted into our home," Martha finished. A chill ran through Caroline despite the warm spring air coming through the open window. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Martha admitted, "but your father seemed shaken by the message. He left immediately." They were interrupted by the sound of the front door, opening and closing, followed by Robert's voice calling up the stairs. Caroline and Martha went down to greet him, finding both Robert and William in the entrance hall. Robert's normally composed demeanor was disturbed. "The strangest thing happened at the hospital," he said without preamble. "One of the older doctors recognized my name and asked if I was related to Richard Reynolds." "What did you say?" Martha asked sharply. "I told him Richard was my uncle. He seemed surprised I knew of him at all." Robert set down his medical bag. "He said he was present when they brought in some of the victims of the Southern Bell. He said he was present when they brought in some of the victims of the Southern Bell explosion," Robert continued, his medical training evident in the clinical precision of his words. He remembered Uncle Richard coming to the hospital that night, distraught, demanding to see the casualties. "That wasn't in any of the newspaper accounts," William noted, glancing at Caroline. "No," Robert agreed. "The doctor, Dr. Holcomb, said Richard was in a state of extreme agitation. He kept saying it wasn't supposed to happen, that they had assured him the boiler would hold for one more journey." "They?" Martha asked, her voice barely audible. "That's what caught my attention," Robert said. "According to Dr. Holcomb, Richard specifically mentioned consulting with the judge about the boiler. He said they had decided together that the repairs could wait." Caroline felt a chill despite the warm spring air. "So there was a witness to Richard's claim about Judge Caldwell's involvement?" "Yes, though Dr. Holcomb admitted he didn't realize the significance of it at the time. It was only later, when the judge began his public campaign against Richard, that he understood the implications." "Why didn't he come forward?" William demanded, the journalist in him outraged at this suppression of truth. Robert's expression was grim. "He said he was visited by two men who made it clear that his future in Nashville, indeed his very safety, depended on his discretion." Martha sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "All these years," she whispered. "So many secrets." The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 5, its familiar chime now seeming to mark not just the hour, but the revelation of decades of hidden truths. "Father has gone to Eleanor Caldwell's house," Caroline told Robert. "Apparently she left papers for him, contingent on our acceptance of the plate." "Acceptance?" Robert questioned. "We didn't exactly have a choice in the matter. It appeared on our table without explanation." "Perhaps that was the test," William suggested thoughtfully. "Not whether we would accept the plate when offered, but how we would respond to its mysterious appearance. And by telling us the story, Father passed the test," Caroline concluded. They fell silent, each contemplating the implications of this theory. "I should go to him," Martha said suddenly, rising from her chair. "He shouldn't face this alone." "We'll all go," William declared, a decisive tone in his voice that reminded Caroline startlingly of their father. 20 minutes later, the 4 Reynolds family members were in their Packard motor car, Thomas's pride and joy, with William at the wheel. Eleanor Caldwell's house stood on a hill in the Belle Meade area, one of the grandest homes in Nashville. Though the grounds showed signs of recent neglect, the imposing Greek Revival mansion remained an impressive sight. Thomas's own car was parked in the circular drive. As they approached the front door, Caroline noticed it was slightly ajar. "Father?" William called as they entered the marble-floored foyer. There was no response, but they could hear sounds coming from deeper within the house. Following the noise, they found themselves in a large library where Thomas Reynolds stood before an open safe, papers scattered across a mahogany desk. He turned at their entrance, his face ashen. "You shouldn't have come," he said, though there was more resignation than anger in his voice. "We know about Dr. Holcomb," Robert said without preamble. "He remembered Richard from the night of the explosion." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Of course he did. I should have realized there would be other witnesses, other loose ends." "What have you found, Thomas?" Martha asked gently, moving to her husband's side. He gestured to the papers on the desk. Eleanor kept records, meticulous records, letters between her father and Richard discussing the shipping line, financial documents showing the judge's investment, and this, he held up a sheet of paper yellowed with age. "Richard's last letter to me, which I never received. It was intercepted, apparently, by one of the judge's men." William stepped forward. "May I?" Thomas handed him the letter. William read it aloud. "My dear brother, by the time you read this, I will likely have departed this world, unable to bear the weight of my guilt any longer. But I cannot leave without unburdening myself of the complete truth. The judge was indeed my partner in the shipping line, and he knew as well as I the dangerous condition of the boiler. In fact, it was he who most strongly opposed the delay for repairs, citing upcoming shipments that would secure our contract with the Louisville merchants. What you do not know, what I've only recently discovered, is that the judge had already arranged to sell his interest in our line. He had quietly purchased shares in the Cumberland Navigation Company and stood to profit enormously if our business failed. I believe now that he saw in the boiler issue an opportunity. Either we would continue operating with a dangerous vessel, risking disaster, or we would suspend operations for repairs, breaking our contracts and damaging our reputation. Either way, he would benefit while appearing blameless. I never imagined he would sacrifice his own son in this calculation. The knowledge that young James died because of our joint decision is unbearable to me. Even more unbearable is the realization that the judge has used his son's death to destroy me while protecting himself. I have confronted him with what I know, hoping perhaps for some admission of shared responsibility. Instead, he offered me a choice: public disgrace and prison, or a private end to my suffering. He has provided the means for the latter. A bottle of laudanum sits before me as I write. I'm a coward, Thomas. I choose the easier path, but I implore you to guard yourself against the judge. He will not stop with my destruction. He will seek to control you, to use you. Do not trust him under any circumstances. Care for our parents in their grief, and someday, when it is safe to do so, let the truth be known. Your loving brother, Richard." The silence that followed William's reading was profound, broken only by the ticking of a clock somewhere in the vast house. "He murdered Richard," Caroline whispered. "He didn't just drive him to suicide, he orchestrated it. And then he approached me," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "Offered me a position at his brother-in-law's bank, a chance to rebuild. All I had to do was never question the official story of the disaster or Richard's death." "And you accepted," William said, not accusingly, but with dawning understanding. "I was 21 years old," Thomas replied. "Our family was ruined. Our parents broken by grief. What would you have had me do?" No one answered. "Besides," Thomas continued, "I had no proof. Only Richard's word against that of Judge Caldwell, the most respected man in Nashville. But now we have proof," Robert said, gesturing to the papers on the desk. "Eleanor preserved it all these years." "Why?" Martha asked. "Why would she keep evidence that implicated her own father?" Thomas shuffled through the papers until he found what he was looking for. According to this letter she wrote last year, she discovered the truth after her father's death in 1890. She found his private papers, including correspondence with Richard about the shipping line. But she still waited more than 30 years to reveal it, Caroline noted. "She writes that she was afraid," Thomas said, scanning the letter. "The judge had powerful friends who outlived him, and she had her mother to consider. But as she felt her own death approaching, she decided the truth needed to be preserved. So she arranged for the plate to come to us," William concluded, "a test to see if we were ready for the truth." Thomas nodded slowly. "The cousin who delivered it. Eleanor's instructions were specific. The plate was to be secretly placed among our china. If we used it and acknowledged its significance, he was to direct me to these papers. And if we had simply put it away, ignored it," Robert asked, "then all of this would have been destroyed," Thomas said, gesturing to the documents. "Eleanor didn't want to force the truth on us if we weren't prepared to face it." Caroline moved to the desk, examining the scattered papers. Among them was a small, leather-bound journal. Opening it, she found Eleanor Caldwell's private diary. The entry for December 20th, 1878, 5 days after Richard's death, caught her eye. "Listen to this," she said, and began to read. "Father returned from the Reynolds funeral looking ill. When I asked what troubled him, he said it was nothing but a chill, but later, as he sat by the fire in his study, I heard him speaking, though no one was present. I did what was necessary," he said to the empty chair across from him. "The family name must be protected at all costs." When I entered, he started violently. "Did you see him?" he demanded. When I asked who he meant, he seemed to collect himself. "No one," he said, "just an old man's fancies." But as I left, I heard him whisper, "You cannot blame me, Richard. You knew the risks as well as I." Caroline looked up from the diary. The judge was seeing Richard's ghost, just as Richard had seen James. Or his guilty conscience was manifesting as hallucination, Robert suggested, ever the medical student. "Does it matter?" William asked quietly. Either way, he was haunted by what he'd done. Thomas had moved to the window, looking out at the carefully maintained gardens that Eleanor had tended until her death. Judge Caldwell died of a stroke in his study in 1890. The servants found him clutching a plate from Eleanor's china service, the one with the crimson flowers. According to Nashville gossip, his last coherent words were, "Take it away." Martha joined her husband at the window. "What will you do with all this, Thomas? After so many years, what purpose would revealing it serve?" Thomas turned to face his family. In that moment, Caroline thought he looked both older and somehow lighter, as if a burden was shifting, if not entirely lifting. "I don't know," he admitted. "For nearly 40 years, I've built my life around protecting our family from this scandal. I've made choices. Some I'm proud of, others I'm not. All with that goal in mind." "Is that why you've been so hard on me?" William asked. "My articles, my choice of career, you saw them as threats to the life you'd constructed." Thomas regarded his younger son with new awareness. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply feared you would make the same mistakes Richard did, allowing ambition to override judgment. I'm not Richard, William said firmly. No, Thomas agreed. You're not. You're better than he was. Better than I was at your age, too. This simple acknowledgement seemed to shift something fundamental between father and son. The truth doesn't belong just to us, Caroline said, her hand still resting on Eleanor's diary. It belongs to all those who lost family on the Southern Belle, Bessie's cousin Isaiah, all the others. You're right, Thomas acknowledged. But revealing it will change everything. The Reynolds name, which I've worked so hard to rehabilitate. We'll stand for honesty finally, Robert interjected. Whatever happens, we face it together. Thomas looked at each member of his family in turn. Martha, his partner in decades of careful reputation management. Robert, the embodiment of his hopes for respectability. William, whose journalistic idealism he had so often disparaged. And Caroline, whose quiet intelligence had always seen more than he credited. Together, he agreed finally. As they gathered the documents, preparing to take them home, a gust of wind blew through the open window, scattering some of the papers. Caroline moved to collect them and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small daguerreotype that had been hidden beneath the other documents. The image showed a young woman, Eleanor, presumably, standing beside a man who could only be Richard Reynolds. They were smiling, clearly in love, unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. Caroline slipped the photograph into her pocket without showing it to the others. Some pieces of the past, she decided, could remain private. As they left Eleanor Caldwell's mansion, the setting sun cast long shadows across the grounds. Caroline thought she glimpsed a figure standing at an upstairs window, a woman in outdated dress, watching their departure. But when she looked again, there was nothing but the reflection of clouds in the glass. That evening, as the Reynolds family gathered once more around their dining table, the mysterious plate with its crimson flowers was conspicuously absent. In its place was the familiar blue-patterned china that had graced their Sunday suppers for as long as Caroline could remember, but something had changed nevertheless. As Thomas carved the roast with the same precision he had always shown, as Martha directed Ida in the serving of vegetables, as Robert and William engaged in their usual brotherly debate, Caroline felt it, a lifting of secrecy, a new openness in their interactions. The plate had held more than food. It had held the past, preserved like Eleanor's papers, waiting for the right moment to yield its secrets. And in doing so, it had set them all free, not from the consequences of long-ago actions which would still need to be faced, but from the burden of silence that had shaped their family for generations. As Caroline raised her glass in a silent toast to Eleanor Caldwell, she thought she heard, very faintly, the whistle of a steamboat on the Cumberland River. But it wasn't the haunting sound her father described from his dreams. Instead, it seemed to her like a farewell, a releasing of old ghosts, a clearing of accounts long overdue. The Reynolds family would face tomorrow with the truth finally laid bare, for better or worse. And that, Caroline decided as she looked around at the people she loved, was worth more than any carefully constructed reputation could ever be.